What if I told you New York had a fully working subway 30 years before it officially existed? 400,000 people rode it, and then it was sealed, erased, and forgotten like it never happened. New York wasn't supposed to wait. By the 1860s, the city was already suffocating. Not slowly, not quietly, but violently, every single day. Lower Manhattan was crammed with over 700,000 people, all forced into streets that were never designed to carry that kind of weight. Horses dragged overloaded carriages through traffic so dense it barely moved. What should have taken minutes stretched into half an hour just to cross a single avenue. And the smell, it hit you before anything else. Rotting manure baked under the summer sun. Dust kicked up into the air with every wheel that turned. Dead horses left where they collapsed because moving them was harder than ignoring them. Newspapers at the time wrote that a healthy man couldn't travel a dozen blocks without getting a headache. This wasn't just inconvenience. This was a system breaking in real time. People adapted the only way they could. They shouted, they pushed, they waited. Life slowed down to the pace of hooves and exhaustion. Commerce suffered. Movement stalled. The city, growing faster than anyone could control, was choking on its own success. And yet, across the ocean, the future had already arrived. In 1863, London opened the world's first underground railway. Trains ran beneath the streets, cutting through congestion, moving thousands of people quickly, efficiently, cleaner, faster, smarter. The solution existed. The blueprint existed. The technology already existed. So why didn't New York follow? Why did one of the richest, most powerful cities in the world, full of engineers, investors, and desperate need, do nothing for 40 years? That's the question that started everything. Because when you start looking closely, the story doesn't make sense. A city on the edge of collapse, a solution already proven to work, and a silence where action should have been. It's not just a delay, it's a gap. And inside that gap is something no one talks about, something buried, something that shouldn't exist but did. Because beneath the chaos, beneath the filth, beneath the endless noise of hooves and wheels, there was already another New York, hidden, silent, and waiting. The deeper you look, the stranger it gets. This wasn't some forgotten sketch or a failed proposal sitting in a dusty office. There were real photographs, taken in 1870, clear enough to see details nobody could fake back then. A tunnel under Broadway, a proper station built underground, not temporary, not experimental, but finished. Walls decorated with fresco paintings, lights glowing softly across the room. Chairs arranged neatly like a place meant for people to stay, not just pass through. In the middle, a fountain with live goldfish swimming inside, like someone actually cared about comfort, about making it feel human down there, not just functional. And then there was the train, not loud, not dirty. No smoke, no steam, no horses dragging it forward. It moved using compressed air, pushed through a sealed tunnel. People who rode it said it felt smooth, like gliding, like the city above didn't exist anymore. You stepped in, sat down, and the noise of New York just disappeared. In the first 2 weeks alone, over 11,000 rides were sold. By the end of the first year, that number reached 400,000. That's not a small test. That's not an accident. That's proof. People didn't just try it, they came back. They trusted it. They wanted more of it. And that's where things stop making sense. Because a system that works like that doesn't just vanish. Not in a city desperate for relief. Not when the public clearly supports it. You don't shut something down that solves a real problem unless something else is standing in the way. Officially, people say it was money, say it was timing, say it just didn't continue. But when you line things up, when you look at what was already built, already running, already loved, those explanations feel thin. Too thin. Because this wasn't a failure. Nothing about it failed. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. And then one day, it stopped. No slow decline. No replacement. Just a hard stop. The entrance disappeared. The tunnel was sealed behind brick. And just like that, something that hundreds of thousands of people experienced was treated like it never mattered. Like it never happened. That's not normal. That's not how cities work. And that's the moment you realize this story isn't about invention. It's about control. So the next question is simple. Who built it? Because something like that doesn't appear out of nowhere. It takes money, skill, and a man stubborn enough to go against a whole city. His name was Alfred Ely Beach, not a random dreamer, not some guy in a basement playing with ideas. He was the owner of Scientific American, one of the most respected publications in the country at the time, a patent lawyer who reviewed thousands of inventions, a man connected to engineers, investors, politicians. He understood how systems worked, and more importantly, how they failed. Beach had been thinking about underground transit since 1849, not as a fantasy, but as a practical solution. He looked at New York and saw exactly what everyone else saw, but he didn't stop at complaining. He broke it down to something simple: a tube, a car, air pressure. That's it. No complicated machinery, no giant infrastructure to start, just a smarter way to move people. In 1867, he built a working model, not on paper, real. A wooden tube about 100 feet long, big enough to carry passengers. A fan at one end pushed the car forward, then reversed to pull it back. People saw it with their own eyes. They stepped inside, felt it move, understood immediately what it meant. This wasn't theory anymore. It worked. And when something works that clearly, that simply, you'd expect the city to support it. But Beach saw something most people didn't. The people in charge weren't interested in better solutions. They were already making money from the problem. Horse cars, elevated railways, contracts, permits. Every piece of that broken system was feeding someone. Fixing it would mean cutting off those profits. So the more you look at it, the clearer it becomes. Beach wasn't just building a subway. He was stepping into a fight he wasn't supposed to win. And that's why what happened next wasn't just bold. It was desperate. He didn't ask for permission anymore. He found a way around it. Beach understood one thing very clearly. If he went the normal way, he would lose before he even started. Permits, approvals, committees, those weren't neutral. They were controlled. And the man sitting at the center of that control was William Tweed. People called him Boss Tweed, not as a joke, as a fact. He didn't just influence New York, he ran it. Behind him was Tammany Hall, a machine that decided who got contracts, who got approvals, and who got shut down. And Tweed had money tied into the current system, horse-drawn transit, proposed elevated railways, everything that already existed above ground. An underground system like Beach's didn't just compete. It threatened to wipe those profits out completely. So no matter how good the idea was, no matter how badly the city needed it, it was never going to be approved. Beach saw that early. And instead of walking away, he changed his approach. He stopped asking for permission to build a subway. He asked for something else, something small, something harmless. He applied for a permit to build pneumatic mail tubes under Broadway, just narrow pipes to send letters and packages across the city. That kind of system already existed in places. It didn't scare anyone. It didn't threaten money. And just like that, the city approved it. On paper, it looked insignificant. But Beach had no intention of building mail tubes, not the way they expected. He had already made up his mind. If the system wouldn't allow him to build the future in the open, he would build it in secret, quietly, right under their feet. And the part that makes this real is how close he got. He rented the basement of a clothing store on Broadway, right near City Hall. That wasn't random. That was the heart of power. The place where the people who would have stopped him walked every day, completely unaware of what was about to happen beneath them. And then the digging started, not during the day, not where people could see. At night, carefully, controlled. Every shovel of dirt removed without drawing attention. No announcements, no signs. Just a group of men working in silence, building something they weren't supposed to build, in a place they were never meant to touch. This wasn't just engineering anymore. This was risk, real risk. Because if they were caught, everything would end right there. But they kept going, night after night. They didn't rush. That's the first thing you notice. No noise, no chaos, no sign that anything unusual was happening. Just steady work, night after night. For 58 nights straight, men went underground with lanterns, digging through dirt and rock beneath Broadway, like they were carving out something the city wasn't ready to see. Every bit of soil had to be moved quietly, carried out without drawing attention. No piles left behind, no trace in the morning. Above them, life went on like normal. Carriages passed, people argued, politicians walked in and out of City Hall. Nobody looked down, nobody knew, and that's what made it possible. Beach didn't just rely on secrecy, he built smarter. Instead of digging randomly, he designed a system to hold the tunnel in place as it moved forward. A circular shield, reinforced, pushed through the ground while workers excavated inside it. It kept the walls from collapsing, kept the structure stable, allowed them to move faster without risking everything caving in. At the time, that kind of method wasn't common in America. This wasn't just a hidden project. It was advanced, controlled, thought through. The tunnel itself stretched over 300 feet, about 9 feet in diameter, lined carefully with brick so it wouldn't give way, every section placed with intention. This wasn't temporary work, it was built to last, and the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. Not because of the ground, but because of what would happen if someone found out. Think about it. A group of men digging a full-scale tunnel under one of the busiest streets in New York without official approval. If that got exposed too early, it wouldn't just be shut down. It would be buried, erased before it even had a chance to prove anything. But Beach kept pushing. He spent his own money, a huge amount for that time, because he knew once people saw it, really saw it, everything would change. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was building proof, something physical, something nobody could deny. And when the tunnel was finally ready, when the system was in place, when the train could actually move from one end to the other, he didn't announce it in advance. He didn't give the city time to react. He waited. And then he made his move all at once. When Beach finally opened it, he didn't ease people into it. He didn't test it quietly or wait for approval. He went straight at them. One day, without warning, he invited journalists, officials, and anyone important enough to matter, not to explain an idea, to show something already finished. People walked into that basement expecting something small, maybe a demonstration, maybe a trick. What they found instead stopped them cold. A full underground station, polished, clean, built with care. Not hidden in darkness, but lit properly, arranged like a place meant to be used every day. It didn't feel like an experiment. It felt complete. And that's what hit them first. This wasn't a concept anymore. It was real, sitting right under their feet while the entire city had no idea it even existed. Beach didn't need to argue. He didn't need to convince anyone with words. He just let them see it, let them step inside, let them sit down. And then the train moved. Smooth, quiet. No shaking, no smoke filling the air, no noise drowning out conversation. Just a steady push forward, like something natural. People looked at each other because they knew immediately what this meant. This wasn't just better. It was different in a way the city had never experienced before. Reporters wrote about it the next day, and the tone was clear. Surprise, yes, but also disbelief. How could something like this exist without anyone knowing? How could it already be working when nobody had approved it? That's the part that made it uncomfortable, because it exposed something bigger. It showed that the problem in New York wasn't a lack of ideas, or skill, or money. The solution had been sitting there the whole time, built by one man who was willing to take the risk. And that meant the real reason it hadn't happened sooner wasn't technical. It was human. People started coming in numbers after that. Not because they were curious, but because they understood what they were looking at. They rode it, talked about it, told others. And just like that, the city had a working underground system. Not planned, not approved, just there. And once people saw it, the question changed. It wasn't, can this work, anymore. It was, why hasn't this already been built everywhere? After that opening, things moved fast. Not behind closed doors anymore, but out in the open where everyone could see. People lined up, not because someone told them to, but because word spread on its own. You didn't need posters or big announcements. One person rode it, then told 10 more. And those 10 came to see it for themselves. That's how you know something is real, not hype, not forced, just people recognizing something useful when they see it. Inside the tunnel, everything stayed consistent. No breakdowns, no chaos, no confusion. The system did exactly what it was supposed to do, over and over again. You stepped in, you moved, you arrived. Simple, clean, reliable. In a city where nothing felt under control, this one thing did. And that made it stand out even more, because outside nothing had changed. Streets were still jammed, horses still collapsing, time still being wasted every single day. But now there was proof that it didn't have to be that way. That's what made this moment dangerous. Not the machine itself, but what it represented. It showed a different path, a better one. And once people see that clearly, they don't forget it. They start asking questions. Why isn't this bigger? Why doesn't it run across the whole city? Why are we still dealing with the same mess above ground when something better already exists below? Those questions didn't come from experts. They came from ordinary people who just experienced the difference with their own eyes. And that kind of pressure builds fast. Beach didn't need to push anymore. The public was doing it for him. They wanted expansion. They wanted more tunnels, more lines, something that could actually replace what they were dealing with every day. But here's where the story shifts again. Because wanting something and getting it are two different things, especially in a place like New York at that time. Because while the public was starting to believe in it, the people in control were starting to feel something else. Pressure. Not the kind they welcome, the kind they resist. Because every day that tunnel kept running, it proved them wrong. And the longer it worked, the harder it became to ignore. So the question wasn't whether the system worked anymore. That part was settled. The real question now was, who would decide what happened next? But there was a limit, and Beach knew it. No matter how well the system ran, no matter how many people showed up, he still didn't have the one thing that mattered most: legal control. He couldn't expand wherever he wanted. He couldn't charge fares the way a real transit system would. Everything operating down there was technically temporary, a demonstration. That's the word they used. It sounded harmless, but it carried weight. Because as long as it was labeled that way, it could be ignored, delayed, or shut down without consequences. The money coming in from riders didn't go into building more tunnels or improving the system. It was directed to charity, to an orphanage. That made it respectable, but it also made it clear this wasn't being treated like a serious piece of infrastructure, not by the people who had the authority to decide. And that's where the pressure started to build again, but in a different direction. The public wanted expansion. That part was obvious, but expansion meant paperwork, approvals, and signatures from people who had already shown they weren't interested. Beach had proven the concept. Now he had to fight for the right to continue it. And this wasn't something he could solve with engineering. This was politics. Slow, controlled, and built to wear people down. He started pushing for a proper franchise, something official that would allow him to extend the line across Manhattan, not just a few hundred feet, but miles of tunnel connecting real parts of the city. On paper, it made sense. The need was clear. The solution was already working. But every step forward ran into resistance. Meetings dragged on. Decisions got delayed. Questions were raised that had already been answered by the system itself. It wasn't direct rejection. That would have been easier to deal with. This was something else. A constant slowing down. A quiet kind of blocking that never said no out loud, but never said yes either. And while that was happening, time kept moving. The city didn't pause. Traffic didn't ease up. The problem Beach was trying to solve kept getting worse, but the solution was stuck in place, waiting for permission that never seemed to come. And that's when it becomes clear, building something real is one thing, getting it accepted is another. Because once control shifts from the hands of the person who built it to the hands of the people who regulate it, everything changes. Beach didn't stop. That's the part people miss. He didn't build something impressive and then step back. He kept pushing, year after year, going straight into a system that was built to slow him down. From 1870 to 1873, he went to the state legislature again and again, asking for the same thing, a legal right to expand what he had already proven worked. Not once, not twice, multiple times, and each time it looked like progress was being made. Bills were introduced, debates were held, votes were passed in both houses. On the surface, it seemed like the system was finally catching up to reality. But then, right at the final step, everything stopped. The governor at the time, John T. Hoffman, vetoed the bills. More than once. Officially, the reason sounded reasonable concerns about control, about whether the city was giving away too much power without proper compensation. That's how it was explained. Clean, formal. Hard to argue against if you didn't look deeper. But when you step back and connect the pieces, it starts to feel different. Because Hoffman wasn't independent. He was closely tied to the same political network that had already shown resistance from the beginning. And while those decisions were being made, something else was happening at the same time. Wealthy property owners along Broadway started pushing back. Lawsuits were filed, claiming that tunneling under the street would damage their buildings, weaken foundations, create risks that couldn't be controlled. On paper, it sounded like concern, but in practice, it did one thing: it slowed everything down even more. Cases moved through the courts, time stretched, momentum faded. And that's how it works when something isn't meant to move forward. Not with one clear decision, but with layers of delay. Politics above, legal pressure from the side, all hitting at once. Beach wasn't being told to stop directly. He was being surrounded. And the longer it went on, the harder it became to keep things moving. Because even with public support, even with a working system already in place, none of that mattered if the people holding authority refused to let it grow. That's when the pattern becomes clear. It's not about whether something works, it's about who decides if it's allowed to exist. By late 1871, something shifted, not because the system suddenly became fair, but because the people running it started to fall apart. William Tweed wasn't untouchable anymore. For years, he and his circle had been moving money through the city like it belonged to them. Contracts inflated, budgets manipulated, public funds disappearing into private hands. Everyone knew it on some level, but knowing and proving are two different things. Then the evidence came out, documents leaked, numbers printed in newspapers. The scale wasn't small, it was massive. Millions of dollars pulled out of the system while the city above ground kept struggling with the same problems. The public reaction was immediate. Anger, pressure, a tension that couldn't be ignored anymore. This time, it didn't fade. Investigations followed. Arrests came after that. Tweed was taken down, piece by piece, until the structure that had protected him for so long finally broke. And when that happened, it opened a door. For the first time, the resistance that had been holding Beach back started to weaken. Not disappear, but loosen. The control wasn't as tight as it used to be. The decisions weren't as predictable. And that mattered, because Beach was still there, still pushing, still ready to move the moment there was space to move into. This wasn't luck. This was timing meeting persistence. Years of being blocked, delayed, pushed aside, and now, suddenly, the wall in front of him wasn't solid anymore. But here's the thing. When a system like that collapses, it doesn't fix itself overnight. The people change, but the structure remains. The habits stay, the hesitation stays. So even with Tweed gone, nothing moved instantly. There was still a process, still approvals needed, still hesitation from people who didn't want to make the wrong decision. Beach had an opening, but he still had to push through it. And he did. He went back again, same request, same plan, but now the environment was different. This time, it reached the final step. This time, it didn't get stopped at the last second. In 1873, the new governor, John Adams Dix, signed the bill. Just like that, after years of resistance, it was official. Beach had full authorization to expand his system. Not just a short tunnel anymore, but miles of underground transit across Manhattan. What he had built in secret was finally allowed to grow in the open. And for a brief moment, it looked like everything was about to change. And then, everything collapsed. Not slowly, not in a way you could prepare for. It hit all at once. Just 3 weeks after the project was finally approved, the financial system broke. J. Cook and Company declared bankruptcy, and that single event triggered what would become known as one of the worst economic crises in the country at the time. Railroads failed, businesses shut down, money disappeared almost overnight. Investors who had promised to back large projects pulled out immediately, not because they changed their minds, but because they had nothing left to give. The entire structure that funding depended on just vanished. And that timing is what makes this part hard to ignore. Years of resistance, years of delays, and right when everything was finally cleared, right when the path was open, the ground dropped out from under it. Beach didn't lose because the idea failed. He didn't lose because people stopped believing in it. He lost because the money behind expansion was gone before it could even begin. And without that, nothing moves. Not at that scale. Not in a city like New York. He had a limited window under his approval to secure funding and start construction. But in the middle of a financial collapse, that window meant nothing. No one was investing. No one was taking risks. Survival came first. Projects like his were the first to be pushed aside. And just like that, momentum disappeared. The same system that had worked, the same idea people had supported, was now stuck again, but this time, not because of politics, because the environment itself had turned against it. And when that happens, there's nothing to fight. You can argue with people, you can push against decisions, but you can't push against a full economic collapse. Beach had done everything right. Built it, proved it, fought for it, won the legal battle, and still, it wasn't enough, because timing matters just as much as effort, maybe more. And this time, timing wasn't on his side. So the expansion never happened. Not because it couldn't, but because it no longer could be funded, and that difference is everything. After that, things didn't drag out. There was no long decline, no slow attempt to recover. It ended in a way that felt almost quiet. The system that had once drawn crowds, that had proven itself day after day, simply stopped operating. No expansion, no new construction, no second chance. Without funding, there was nothing left to push forward, and once momentum is gone, it's hard to get it back. Beach didn't shut it down because it failed. He shut it down because there was no path left to continue. The tunnel was sealed. Brick by brick, the entrance was closed off, cutting it off from the city above like it had never been there. The train stayed where it was, resting on the tracks, untouched, not dismantled, not reused, just left behind. That detail matters, because if something is useless, you take it apart, you reuse it, sell it, move on. But this wasn't treated like something worthless. It was left intact, like it was paused rather than ended, and then time took over. Years passed. The city kept growing, kept struggling with the same problems that system had already solved. New projects came and went, different ideas, different attempts, but nothing changed the fact that a working solution had already existed and was now buried underground. Beach didn't disappear overnight, but the attention around him did. The excitement faded. The headlines stopped. People moved on to other issues, other stories. That's how it happens. Not with a clear decision to forget, but with silence. Gradual, steady silence. By the time he died in 1896, his work wasn't being talked about anymore. No major recognition, no place in the story of the city's development. Just a small mention, easy to overlook. And 2 years after that, the building where the entrance once stood was destroyed by fire. Whatever remained of the station above ground gone. No physical reminder left where people could point and say, this is where it started. At that point, it wasn't just inactive. It was erased from view. Not officially, not announced, just gone from sight. And when something disappears like that, it becomes easier to ignore. Easier to act like it never really mattered. But the tunnel was still there. Under the street, behind brick, untouched, waiting. For decades, nothing happened. Not a rumor, not a rediscovery, nothing that brought it back into public view. Life above ground kept moving forward, louder, more crowded, more complicated, but down there, it stayed the same. Sealed, quiet, untouched. People forgot because there was nothing left to remind them. No entrance, no sign, no reason to even think about what was under their feet. And that's how something real disappears. Not by being destroyed, but by being ignored long enough that it stops existing in people's minds. Then in 1912, it came back. Not through research, not through memory, but by accident. Workers were digging to build a new subway line, part of what would eventually become the modern system. They weren't looking for anything unusual. Just doing their job, cutting through ground that had already been built over, layer after layer, and then they broke through a wall that wasn't supposed to be there. Behind it was empty space. A tunnel, not collapsed, not damaged, intact. The air inside was dry, still, almost preserved. And when they stepped further in, they saw it. The tracks, the structure, and the car, sitting exactly where it had been left. Not rusted into nothing, not buried under debris, just there, like time had stopped around it. 42 years. That's how long it had been sitting underground, waiting without movement, without purpose, without anyone coming back. Think about that for a second. A fully built system, proven to work, used by thousands of people, and then left untouched for over 4 decades. Not upgraded, not studied, just forgotten. The workers didn't expect it. Nobody did. Because by that point, the official story had already moved on. The subway that existed in people's minds was the one being built now, not the one that had already existed before, but standing in that tunnel, looking at something that shouldn't have been there anymore, it forced a different realization. This wasn't a myth. It wasn't exaggerated history. It was physical proof, still sitting in place, that everything people thought came later had already been done once before. They documented it. That's important. This wasn't something they glanced at and ignored. They took photographs, wrote reports, confirmed what they were seeing. The tunnel, the structure, even the equipment used to build it. It was all still there, like a time capsule sealed off from everything above. There was even a tunneling shield, the same kind of tool Beach had used to push forward underground, still positioned where work had stopped. It hadn't been removed, hadn't been reused anywhere else. Just left behind, like the entire project had been frozen in place. And for a brief moment, it looked like this discovery might bring everything back into the light. Because now there was no denying it. Not theory, not second-hand stories. Physical evidence. You could stand there and see it with your own eyes. But that moment didn't last. Because the workers weren't there to preserve history. They were there to build something new. The modern subway system was already in motion, already planned, already funded. And that meant one thing: anything in the way had to go. The old tunnel wasn't restored. It wasn't turned into a landmark. It wasn't protected. It was cleared out, broken down, removed piece by piece to make space for what was coming next. The car that had sat there for decades, waiting, was destroyed. The structure that had proven the idea decades earlier was dismantled. What could have been preserved as proof was erased again. Some parts were saved, at least for a while. The tunneling shield was reportedly taken and given to Cornell University. An artifact, something that should have been studied, displayed, remembered. But over time, even that disappeared. Lost, misplaced, no clear record of where it ended up. And that's where it becomes harder to ignore the pattern. Something built, something proven, something rediscovered, and then removed again. Not hidden this time, not sealed behind brick, but still gone. The city moved forward, the new system took shape, and the old one faded back out of sight. And once that happens twice, it stops feeling like coincidence. After that second disappearance, the story didn't come back. Not in any real way. The city kept building, expanding, improving what people now recognize as the official subway system. Trains ran, tunnels stretched further, millions of people depended on it every day. And over time, that became the only version people knew. The idea that something similar had already existed decades earlier just didn't fit into the narrative anymore. It wasn't taught, wasn't emphasized, wasn't part of how the system explained itself, and when something isn't repeated, it fades. Not because it's false, but because it's inconvenient. What's left are fragments, mentions here and there, scattered references that don't connect unless you go looking for them. A lawsuit filed by the company that inherited Beach's rights after the destruction of the tunnel. No clear record of how it ended. No final decision that people can point to and say, this is what happened. Just another loose end. Then there are the smaller details, the ones that should be simple but aren't. A plaque supposedly created to honor Beach somewhere near City Hall. No one seems to know exactly where it is, or if it was ever installed at all. A possible access point near Reed Street that might still connect to a piece of the old tunnel, but no serious effort to explore it. It's not that the information is completely gone. It's that it's scattered, incomplete, easy to overlook. And when you put all of that together, it leaves a different kind of question. Not, did this happen? Because that part is already answered. It did. The question becomes something else. Why does so little of it remain visible? Why isn't there a clear marker, a preserved section, something obvious that acknowledges where it all began? Because cities usually celebrate their firsts. They mark them, protect them, turn them into history people can see. But this one doesn't follow that pattern. It sits in the background, half visible, easy to miss unless you already know where to look. And that's what makes it stay with you, not just what was built, or how it worked, but how easily it slipped out of sight. Years later, people started talking about new ideas again. Faster transport, cleaner systems, something beyond what already existed. Different names, different proposals, but when you strip it down, the core idea sounded familiar. A sealed tube, a vehicle moving inside it, air pressure doing the work. Not something entirely new, just presented like it was. In 2013, Elon Musk introduced the concept of the Hyperloop, high-speed travel through low-pressure tubes, moving people faster than traditional trains. The media picked it up immediately. Headlines called it revolutionary, a fifth mode of transportation, something futuristic that could change how cities connect. And on the surface, it sounded impressive. Clean, efficient, forward-thinking. But if you step back and look at it without the branding, without the presentation, the structure is simple. A tube, a car, air pressure moving it forward. That's it. The same core idea that had already been built and tested more than a century earlier. The difference wasn't in the concept. It was in how it was being introduced. This time, it wasn't hidden. It wasn't built in secret. It was announced publicly, discussed globally, backed by modern attention and technology. But even with that, it still faced delays, questions, uncertainty. Studies, projections, feasibility reports years passed, and nothing fully operational at scale came out of it. And that's where the comparison becomes hard to ignore. In 1870, with far less advanced tools, Beach had already built a working version of that idea. People rode it. It functioned. It proved the concept in real conditions, and yet it disappeared. Now, over 100 years later, the same idea is being presented again, still not fully realized. That doesn't mean nothing has changed. Technology has improved, materials are better, systems are more advanced. But the core question stays the same. If something worked before, why are we still trying to prove it now? And more importantly, what stopped it from continuing the first time? Because when the same idea shows up again after being buried once, it forces you to look at the gap in between. Not just what was built, but what was lost, and why it didn't carry forward. At this point, it stops feeling like a simple story about invention. It starts to look like a pattern. Something gets built, it works, people respond to it, and then something steps in and slows it down, redirects it, or removes it completely. Not always in the same way, not always for the same reason, but the result ends up similar. Progress doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in bursts, then stalls. And when it stalls long enough, people forget where it left off. What Beach built didn't fail on its own. That's the key detail. It wasn't abandoned because it couldn't perform. It was blocked, delayed, and then overtaken by events that had nothing to do with whether it worked or not. Politics slowed it. Economics stopped it. Time erased it. None of those things are technical problems. They're human ones, and that's where the focus shifts. Because it's easy to assume that if something is good enough, it will naturally succeed, that the best idea wins. But history doesn't always follow that rule. Sometimes the outcome depends more on who controls the decisions than on how strong the idea actually is. In Beach's case, control was never in his hands. Not fully. He could build, he could prove, he could push, but the final step always depended on people who had their own interests, their own priorities. And when those don't line up with the solution doesn't move forward, no matter how effective it is. That's not a theory. That's what happened. And once you see it clearly in one case, it becomes easier to recognize in others. Different industries, different time periods, same structure. Something that could move things forward gets held back, not because it's impossible, but because it doesn't fit into what already exists. And that raises a harder question. Not about the past, but about the present. How many ideas have followed the same path? How many systems worked but never scaled? How many solutions were proven but never allowed to grow? You don't always see them, because most don't leave behind a tunnel you can rediscover. Most just disappear quietly, without physical proof. And that's what makes this one stand out, because it did leave something behind. Enough to show that it wasn't just possible, it was already done. So, in the end, it comes back to something simple. Not complicated, not hidden behind technical language, just a straight question. If a working system already existed, and people used it, and it proved itself in real conditions, why did everything reset like it never happened? Because what we see today looks like a beginning. The official story says the subway started later, developed step by step, improved over time. But that only makes sense if you ignore what came before. Once you include it, the timeline changes. It's not a straight line anymore. It's a break, a gap where something real existed, then disappeared, and had to be built again from the ground up. And rebuilding something that already worked is not progress. It's repetition. That's what stands out the most. Not the invention itself, but the fact that it didn't carry forward. Because usually, when something works, it becomes the foundation for what comes next. It gets improved, expanded, refined. It doesn't just vanish, but here it did. And when it came back years later in a different form, it was treated like a new idea, like no one had done it before. That disconnect is hard to ignore. It forces you to look at the system around it, not just the invention itself. Who decides what continues and what stops? Who controls which ideas get scaled and which ones stay small? Those decisions shape more than just one project. They shape the direction everything moves in after that. Beach proved that the technology wasn't the problem. The tools were there. The concept was clear. The execution worked. What failed was everything around it. The environment, the timing, the control. And those are the parts that don't show up in simple histories. They get smoothed over, simplified, turned into clean timelines that make sense on the surface. But when you dig into it, when you follow each step without skipping anything, you see where things didn't line up. And once you see that clearly, it changes how you look at everything that came after, because it suggests something uncomfortable. That progress isn't always about what we can build. Sometimes it's about what we're allowed to keep. Once you reach this point, the story stops being about the past. It starts pressing into the present. Because what happened back then doesn't stay back then. The structure behind it, the way decisions are made, the way ideas move or don't move, that part doesn't disappear. It just changes form. The details look different today, more advanced, more organized, but the core is still there. Someone builds something that works. Not perfect, but real enough to prove a direction. People see it, respond to it, start to believe in it. And then it hits a wall. Not always a clear wall, not something you can point at easily. Sometimes it's funding that dries up at the wrong time. Sometimes it's regulations that stretch out longer than expected. Sometimes it's competing systems that already have money and influence behind them. And when all of that stacks up, progress slows down, even if the idea itself is solid. That's the part most people don't think about. They assume if something is good enough, it will push through, that it will find a way. But that only happens if the conditions allow it. If the timing lines up, if the people in control see value in letting it grow. Without that, even the best ideas stall. Beach's story makes that clear because it's not abstract. You can trace every step. You can see where it moved, where it stopped, and what caused each shift. Nothing random about it, and that's what makes it harder to dismiss. Because it shows that progress isn't just built by inventors or engineers, it's shaped by everything around them. Systems, power, money, timing, all of it working together or against each other. And when those forces don't align, even something that works can disappear. Not because it wasn't ready, but because the environment wasn't ready to accept it. That's a different way of looking at history. Not as a straight path of improvement, but as something uneven, full of starts and stops, where what survives isn't always the best option, but the one that fits the moment. And when you start looking at it that way, you stop asking, why didn't it succeed, and start asking something else. Who had something to lose if it did? Because every system that exists, even a broken one, is still feeding someone. Money moves through it, power sits inside it, people depend on it staying exactly the way it is. Change doesn't just improve things, it shifts control. And that's where resistance comes from. Not always loud, not always obvious, but consistent. In Beach's time, the streets above ground weren't just transportation, they were business. Horse lines, contracts, maintenance, land value, everything connected. Replacing that with something underground didn't just solve traffic, it cut into existing profits. And when that happens, you don't always see a direct fight. You see delays, doubts, questions that never fully resolve. Enough to slow things down until momentum fades. That's how control works when it doesn't want attention. It doesn't say no clearly. It just makes sure yes never fully happens. And once you recognize that pattern, it's hard to ignore it elsewhere. Different time, different industry, same structure. A solution appears, gains attention, then runs into invisible resistance. Not strong enough to kill it instantly, but enough to weaken it over time. And if something stays in that state long enough, people lose interest. They move on. The window closes. That's what happened here. Not a single moment where everything ended, but a series of pressures that added up until continuation was no longer possible. And the system didn't need to destroy the idea directly, it just needed to outlast it. Because time does the rest. People forget. Priorities shift. What once felt urgent becomes distant. And when that happens, even something proven can fade out of relevance. That's the part that makes this story heavier than it looks on the surface. It's not just about something being built and lost. It's about how easily something real can be pushed aside when it doesn't fit into what already exists. By now, it's not about proving anything anymore. The proof was there, built in brick and steel, seen, used, documented. What's left is understanding what it means. Because once something like that happens, it changes how you look at everything that comes after. You stop assuming progress is always forward. You start noticing where it pauses, where it disappears, where it gets rebuilt like it never existed before. And that changes the questions. It's no longer, what can we build? It becomes, what actually gets to survive? Because those are not the same thing. Beach built something real, that part is settled. But survival doesn't depend on reality alone. It depends on alignment, timing, power, acceptance, conditions. All of it has to line up. Miss one. And even something solid can fall out of the timeline. That's what happened here. They repeat the process, thinking they're the first to solve the problem. And that's where the cost shows up. Not just in time, but in lost direction. Because when you don't carry forward what already worked, you spend years rediscovering the same ground. That's not progress. That's delay wearing a different name. And the hardest part is, most people don't notice it happening. They see new projects, new ideas, new announcements, and assume everything is moving ahead. But underneath that, there can be gaps, places where something already existed, already proved itself, but didn't make it through. Beach's story is one of those gaps. Clear enough to trace, solid enough to confirm, but still disconnected from the path that followed. And once you see that gap clearly, it doesn't stay isolated. It raises a bigger thought. Not about one invention, not about one city, but about the system itself. Because if something like this could happen once, with this much evidence behind it, there's no reason to assume it only happened once. So you start looking wider, not just at this one case, but at everything around it. Different time periods, different industries, same kind of pattern showing up again and again. Something gets built, proves it can work, gains attention, and then it stalls. Not always in a dramatic way, not always obvious. Sometimes it just slows down quietly until people stop paying attention. And once attention is gone, momentum goes with it. That's when things fade. Not because they were wrong, but because they didn't stay in focus long enough to grow. Beach's system didn't fail in the way people usually think about failure. It didn't collapse, didn't break down, didn't get rejected by the public. It lost its position. That's a different kind of ending. It got pushed out of the path that development followed. And once something falls off that path, it doesn't matter how good it was. What matters is what replaces it. The new system that came later didn't build directly on what he had done. It moved in a different direction, with different methods, different priorities. And over time, that became the standard. That's what people recognize now. That's what gets improved, expanded, invested in. The original idea doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes separate from the main line of progress, like a branch that got cut off early. And when you think about it like that, it changes how you define innovation. It's not just about creating something new. It's about whether that something stays connected to what comes next. Because if it doesn't shape the future. It just becomes a forgotten attempt, no matter how successful it was in its own moment. That's the part that stays with you. Beach didn't just build something ahead of his time. He built something that didn't get the chance to carry forward into its time. And that gap between those two things, that's where the real story sits. And when something falls out like that, it doesn't leave clean edges behind. It leaves questions. Not loud ones, not the kind people rush to answer, but quiet ones that stay there if you think about it long enough. Why didn't it continue? Why wasn't it preserved? Why wasn't it used as a base for what came next? Because logically, that's what should have happened. You take what works, you improve it, you expand it. That's how most systems grow, but here, that chain broke. And when a chain breaks, you don't just lose the next step, you lose everything that could have followed from it. That's the part people don't measure. Not just what existed, but what never got the chance to exist because of it. Think about the years between 1000 870, and the early 1900s. Decades where the city kept dealing with the same problems, building solutions from scratch, investing time and effort into something that had already been proven in a different form. That's not just delay, that's lost direction. And it doesn't show up clearly in history because history focuses on what happened, not on what could have happened differently, but the gap is there. You can feel it when you line things up. A working system, a break, and then a restart years later as if nothing came before. That reset isn't natural, it's the result of something interrupting the flow. And once you accept that, the story shifts again. It's no longer about a single invention being ahead of its time. It's about timing being out of sync with everything around it. Beach moved early, the environment moved late. And in between those 2 points, the connection was lost. That's all it takes. Not failure, not rejection, just a mismatch in timing strong enough to break continuity. And when continuity breaks, progress doesn't stop completely. It just starts over somewhere else, without carrying what came before. At some point, you stop looking for a clean answer, because there isn't one. It's not one decision, not one person, not one moment that explains everything. It's layers. Politics, money, timing, control all stacking on top of each other until the path forward just disappears. Not blocked in a way you can clearly see, but redirected, slowed, stretched until it no longer leads where it was supposed to go. That's what makes this hard to pin down, because every piece on its own looks reasonable. A veto here, a lawsuit there, a financial collapse at the worst possible time. Each one has its own explanation. But when you put them together, they don't feel random anymore. They line up too well, one after another, each step hitting right when it matters most. And that's where the discomfort comes in. Because it forces you to question whether this was just bad timing or something more structured than that. Not necessarily planned in a single room, not coordinated in a simple way, but shaped by a system that protects what already exists. A system that doesn't need to attack something directly to stop it. It just needs to make sure it never fully takes hold. And once that happens, time finishes the job. People move on. The urgency fades. What once felt like the future becomes something distant, almost irrelevant. That's how something real turns into something forgotten. Not overnight, not through one clear action, but through a series of small shifts that add up over time. And by the time you look back, it's already gone from the main story. What's left are fragments, enough to trace what happened, but not enough to keep it alive in the present. And that's the part that stays unresolved. Not because the facts aren't there, but because the meaning behind them depends on how you connect those pieces. By the time you reach the end of this, the facts are already set. Nothing here needs to be proven again. What was built, what was used, what was lost, it's all there if you follow it step by step. So the story stops being about discovery. It becomes about acceptance. Accepting that something real existed and didn't carry forward the way it should have. Accepting that progress didn't follow a clean line. And once you accept that, it forces you to rethink how you see everything that came after. Because the version most people know feels complete. A city struggled, then eventually solved its problem. But when you include what happened earlier, that version doesn't hold the same way. It becomes incomplete. Like part of the story was cut out, and the rest was built around that gap. And when something is missing like that, it changes the meaning of what remains. The modern system isn't wrong. It works. It moves millions of people every day. But it's not the full beginning. It's a continuation that started over instead of building forward. And that difference matters, even if most people don't think about it. Because it shows that progress isn't guaranteed to keep its own history intact. It can lose parts of itself along the way. Not intentionally, not always clearly, but effectively. And when that happens, what we call development becomes harder to define. Is it a straight improvement over time, or is it a series of restarts shaped by what survives each phase? That's not something you can answer with one example alone. But this example makes the question real. It takes something concrete and shows where the line broke. And once you see one break clearly, you start wondering how many others exist that aren't as easy to trace. At this stage, the story doesn't need more details. It needs clarity, because everything that happened is already enough to show the shape of it. A system that worked, a city that needed it, a public that accepted it, and still, it didn't continue. That's the core. Everything else, politics, lawsuits, financial collapse, those are pieces that explain how it happened, but not why it was allowed to happen that way. And that's where the focus shifts again, because how is easier to answer. It's visible, it's documented, but why sits deeper. It sits in the structure of the system itself, in who holds decision-making power, in what gets prioritized, in what gets protected, because not every solution fits into the system that exists at the time. Some require too much change, too much disruption. And when that happens, the system doesn't always adapt. Sometimes it resists, not openly, not in a way that's easy to point at, but enough to keep things from moving forward. And if that resistance lasts long enough, it wins without needing to prove anything. That's what this comes down to. Not whether the idea was good, but whether the environment allowed it to grow. Beach proved one part, the system decided the other. And when those two don't align, the outcome is already set, even if it takes years to fully play out. That's not a dramatic ending. It's a quiet one. The kind where nothing explodes, nothing collapses in a single moment, but the direction changes anyway. And once it changes, it doesn't easily go back. Because new paths form, new systems take over, and what came before becomes harder to reconnect. Not impossible, just unlikely. And over time, unlikely becomes forgotten. So what's left at the end isn't confusion. It's a choice in how you look at it. You can see it as an isolated case, something unusual that happened once under specific conditions. A mix of bad timing, political resistance, and economic collapse. That explanation works on the surface. It's clean, easy to accept, doesn't force you to question anything beyond that moment. Or you can look at it differently, as an example of how fragile progress really is. How something can be fully real, fully functional, and still not make it through. Not because it lacks value, but because it doesn't fit the structure around it at the time. That version isn't as comfortable, because it doesn't stay in the past. It reaches forward. It suggests that the same kind of thing can happen again, in different forms, under different names. And maybe it already has. That's the part that doesn't come with a clear answer, because you can't measure what never made it through. You can only see what did. But once you understand how something like this unfolds, it changes the way you interpret what you're seeing now. New ideas don't just need to work. They need the right conditions to survive, and those conditions aren't always visible. They sit in the background, shaping outcomes quietly. That's what this story leaves behind. Not a single conclusion, not a final statement, but a shift in perspective. Because once you see how something real can disappear from the main path of history, it's hard to assume that everything we have today represents the full picture. It might just be what made it through. By the time you get here, there's nothing left to uncover. No hidden document that changes everything, no final detail that suddenly makes it all make sense. What happened is already clear enough. A man built something that worked. People used it. The system around it didn't carry it forward. That's the full line, stripped down to its core. And when you reduce it like that, it becomes harder to hide behind explanations. Because explanations can stretch, they can soften the edges, they can make things feel more reasonable than they really were, but the core doesn't change. Something real existed, and then it didn't continue. That's it. And from there, everything else becomes a reflection of that fact. The city moved on. New systems replaced old problems. Life continued, just like it always does. Most people never needed to know what came before, so they didn't. The official story filled in the gaps well enough to keep things moving. And for most, that's enough. But if you follow the full line, from beginning to end, without skipping the parts that don't fit neatly, it leaves a different impression. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just incomplete. Like something important was left out, not entirely erased, but pushed far enough to the side that it no longer shapes how the story is told. And that's where this ends. Not with a reveal, not with a twist, but with a realization. That progress, as clean as it looks from the outside, doesn't always carry everything with it. Sometimes it leaves things behind, and sometimes those things weren't failures. They were just not allowed to continue. And when you sit with that for a moment, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet, almost too simple for something that big. Because nothing exploded, no single event you can point at and say, that's where everything ended. It just slipped. One step lost, then another, until the whole thing was no longer part of the path people were following. That's how it usually happens. Not with noise, but with distance. The further something gets from attention, the easier it is to leave it behind. And once it's behind you, the next steps don't include it anymore. They build on something else. That's what New York did. It didn't go back and pick up where Beach left off. It moved forward in a different direction, built a system that worked, and over time, that became the story everyone accepted. Functional, effective, real, but disconnected from what came before. And that disconnection is what matters, because it shows that progress doesn't always build on the best foundation. It builds on the foundation that survives. And survival isn't just about quality. It's about timing, support, acceptance, everything lining up, just enough to let something continue. Beach had part of that, but not all of it. And missing even one piece was enough to stop everything from carrying forward. That's not failure in the usual sense. It's interruption. An interruption doesn't erase what happened. It just breaks the line. What comes after might still work, might even work better in some ways, but it starts from a different point. It doesn't include everything that was already proven, and that's the part people don't see unless they go looking for it. Because from the outside, everything looks continuous, smooth, logical. Like each step leads naturally to the next, but underneath that there can be breaks, gaps where something real existed and didn't make it through. And once you know that, it changes how you see the whole structure. Not just this story, but any story about progress. Because it reminds you that what we have today isn't necessarily everything that was possible. It's just what made it through. And that's where it really lands. Not in the past, not in the tunnel, not in the man who built it, but right here, in how you see things now. Because once you understand this story fully, you don't just walk away with facts. You walk away with a different way of looking at progress itself. You stop assuming that everything we have today is the natural result of the best ideas winning. You start seeing it as something filtered, something shaped, something that passed through layers of control, timing, and acceptance before it was allowed to stay. And that means something important. It means there were other paths, other directions things could have gone. Some of them were built, some of them worked, but they didn't make it through. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't fit at the time they appeared. That's the part that stays with you, because it doesn't end with Beach, it doesn't end with New York, it doesn't even end with that era. It extends forward into every system that exists now. Technology, infrastructure, ideas, none of them move in isolation. They move inside structures that decide what grows and what stops. And those decisions aren't always visible. They don't always come with clear explanations, but they shape everything that comes after. So when you look back at that tunnel, at something that worked, something people used, something that should have continued and didn't, it leaves you with one last thought. Not about what happened, but about what else might have happened the same way. What else worked and disappeared? What else was built and never carried forward? What else are we still waiting for that already existed once before? Because the tunnel is gone, the system is gone, the physical proof was broken down and cleared away, but the pattern didn't disappear with it. That stayed. And once you see that pattern clearly, it doesn't go away. It changes how you look at everything that comes next.